kind of lightning in a bottle. That was a phrase that a friend of mine used that has always stuck with me, because I've come to terms with the fact that anything that I do after Dungeon World is likely not going to be anywhere. I mean, nothing I've done so far has been as big. Nothing I do ever again may be as big. And I'm cool with that now, because I've realized that some ideas, you're just, the right people in the right place at the right time with the right idea, and everything comes together and it all hits, it clicks.
It's been several months since I sat down and talked to Sage LaTorra. We discussed where Dungeon World came from, the design philosophy behind it, but then we divert, and that's when this conversation really gets interesting. Over the last several years interviewing creators, we've talked about some pretty deep stuff, but buckle up because Sage and I get real deep. We talk about some general theories behind games, how to look in the rearview mirror at creations that may or may not have aged well, and what's great about new games, and what we love about old games. I want to give a special shout out to 3 of our newest patrons, John Sheffield, Connell Damiano, and Ryan Sell. All right, sit back, relax, and enjoy my time with Sage.
Third Floor Wars delivers interviews, insights, and discussions about everything hitting the tabletop. Rulebooks, plastic models, dice, and cards in hand. Let the gaming begin. Tabletop games let you escape and unleash grand battles and regale epic tales of adventure with your friends. If you love gaming and learning from players, designers, experts, and creators, you are in the right place. Pull up a chair. Craig and Ray welcome you to the Third Floor and the Tabletop Talk Podcast.
Greg here on the Third Floor. Today we're talking to Sage LaTorra. Now, Sage has been very involved within the community itself of role-playing, but he's probably best known for the very unique and interesting Dungeon World RPG. So, Sage, welcome to the Third Floor.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk role-playing games. Honestly, sometimes it's hard to stop me from talking. So this will be an adventure for both of us.
You came to the right place. So I'm going to say this, and if I have any previous guests listening, this is not a knock on you, but I've really been looking forward to this interview, and I look forward to a lot of interviews, but I've been extra special looking forward to this. And part of the reason is, for listeners not familiar with Sage, is not only Sage, was a co-author of Dungeon World, which, for those listening, if you heard my interview with Meg and Vincent Baker, you know that it's built off of Powered by the Apocalypse, and we actually talked a little bit about Dungeon World in that interview as well. But I have been following and stalking is probably a better word, stalking Sage a little bit, and it's really interesting. Sage's thoughts on role playing and the way that he looks at it, both mechanically as well as the softer sides of it as well. So Sage, before we get into all of those goodies, I want to talk about you discovering gaming. So at one point in your life, you had never seen dice, you'd never rolled dice, you never pretended to be somebody else, never moved little models across the table. When did that world first open up to you?
Sure. For me, I mean, I think in retrospect, it seems kind of inevitable, given just kind of how nerdy I was and how nerdy my family was. But the definite point where I first actually sat down to play a role-playing game was with my good friend Isaac. He's actually one of the artists on Dungeon World. He was the best man at my wedding.
Wow. Closest
friend. We had been friends for a while. We played Magic together, stuff like that. And then he asked me if I wanted to play D&D, and I was like, well, I'm a nerd. I should love this. And the problem is he didn't know the rules really, and he had one solo Dark Sun adventure. I don't even know what adventure this was. And just kind of
started you off dark.
Yeah.
Dark Sun is
started right there. I was a wizard in a pit fight. I didn't understand the rules. I didn't know how spells work. So I was just a guy with a knife in a pit fight. We didn't get very far with that game. But that was really my first experience with D&D, or with role-playing games at all, and D&D in particular. And that was, in name at least, second edition. But really it was Isaac's memory of second edition, because I think the group he had been playing with at the time, everybody else had the core books. So he just had the adventure, and we were kind of like making it up as we went. And this must have been late 90s, because third edition came out not too long after that. And I bought the third edition books as they came out because they did this weird staggered release. So I got the player's handbook, which at the time they sold it with a little insert in the back. So you had a little bit about XP and magic items and monsters. So you could, play the whole game. That was a weird release schedule. But that was what I had. And so I created a dungeon to run my siblings through. And the first room, I was literally like, oh, well, it was like a 20 by 20 room, and I was like, well, there's this many squares, let's put that many kobolds in it. Like they're wall-to-wall kobolds, 5-foot squares. I hadn't figured out the rules about like squeezing between things yet, so it was just a whack-a-mole of kobolds. So it's kind of amazing that I stuck with role-playing games, really.
Well, it sounds like you like created tower defense gaming at the same time.
Yeah, pretty much. It was they were at the entrance to the dungeon. I never bothered to say what was outside of it, and so there was a door behind them and kobolds in front of them, and I don't think we even finished that combat. And then, for years I played third edition D20, picked up far more books for that game than I ever used. And then, a big pivot for me was through a few of my friends back home in New Mexico. I started, they were online enough to know about games like Burning Wheel. So I got to play some Burning Wheel with them, and kind of found out about a wider audience of games. And then amazingly, I moved out here to Seattle, which is where I am now. And
that's a good place for gaming.
Yeah, it's great. And that's part of how it worked out. My aunt actually had gone to school out here, and she comes out back to see friends about once a year. And so I had just moved out here for work, and my aunt came out for a normal visit and says, oh, my friend's having a party. Why don't you come over? Because I think my friend's boyfriend would be somebody that you get along with. And so that turned out to be John Harper. And
isn't that funny?
Yeah, we sat around drinking a beer and did this very kind of like awkward conversation of figuring out when somebody says you're into role-playing games, are we going to sit here and like talk about your fighter build for 30 minutes? And so we kind of start like name dropping the I recently did a Burning Wheel game. That was pretty good. And he's like, oh, okay. Like I can see that we're kind of on the same page here. And so,
please don't tell me about your paladin. Please don't tell me about your paladin.
Like I think both of us were expecting, because of how the introduction was through folks who didn't quite get what we were doing. We were sure that it was going to be like, oh yeah, this guy, played D&D once in college or something. And and then through John Harper, I met lots of other gaming folks out here because there's just none of them in Seattle. And that, in particular, I gamed regularly with John Harper for years, and that was a big influence on Dungeon World. Like, obviously Adam's the co-author, but between John Harper and Paul and Shannon Riddle, they are kind of the whatever the fifth Beatle is. Like the unnamed collab, or we thanked them in the book, obviously, but they're the
best of Dungeon World.
Yeah. They're the people who had a huge influence on that. And also some other folks that we hung out with regularly then, like Jonathan Walton, and all these folks have gone on to make their own excellent games. So there's something to be said for lucking into an amazing collection of people.
Yeah, but I think for a lot of listeners, I mean, obviously we don't run into John Harper and and stuff like that. But at the same time, a lot of us lucked into our first gaming groups, right? Where you just kind of figured it out. And, there's a lot. And I imagine, because like I hear the stories all the time where like, I had a neighbor who was into it and, we ended up falling in love with it. And he's been my friend for 25 years. Right. I guess that there must be a lot of stories of people that had shitty neighbors that play D&D and they don't ever make it to my podcast, I guess. So, because they hate role playing, right? Yeah.
The number of people who bounce off from a first bad experience has got to be huge. And then there's the rest of us who somehow there's magic there early on and it clicks.
So when we go back in time, Sage, and think about Dungeons & Dragons Isaac Edition, what was it that, because it hooked you, right? It hooked you enough to buy 3 and to spend too much money on it and stuff like that. When you look back on it, can you get a sense as adult Sage figuring out what was it that young Sage really liked?
Oh, wow. You're cutting right to the deep questions. This is This is incredibly insightful. I think, oh man, there's a few aspects there that I think really resonated with me. Um, I think there's the imagination aspect, the open-endedness that is kind of like one of the core things of role-playing games that like uh I really try hard not to define role-playing games, but as close as I can get to like a functioning, practical definition, part of a role-playing game is the fact that we say things about a fictional situation, and the what we say about the fictional situation affects the rules, and the rules affect that fiction back in, like this is basically Vincent's kind of loop of Apocalypse World. And so that was the first time I had played a game like that, where, if I was playing Magic with Isaac, because we'd played a lot of Magic before, and like I have a card that looks really cool, and I'm like, yeah, this Phyrexian's gonna eat your elf, and like the rules don't change because of that fiction. Whereas we were sitting there playing, and I could be like, yeah, like I fumble my knife like I'm going to drop it, and then like recover it and stab the guy and surprise him. And sure, we were very new to this. We didn't know how to really make that like function rules wise, but it was cool to be able to say that.
Well, you can say it out loud, which is, it sounds silly, but it's a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. And that interaction with people, like there's a portion of role-playing games that really is like permission to say funny stuff, or not funny always, but like say imaginative stuff. And so that imaginative aspect, I think, was one big side of it. And then I think also kind of the game side of it. I've never been much for kind of rules, min-maxing kind of stuff, but I'm definitely the kind of person who loves new rules content and figuring out new and interesting ways to like use this stuff. And I think that's part of why D20 definitely kind of bit me like pretty well, because everybody had these things. Most of them didn't work, but like, yeah, whatever I was interested in, somebody had made their cheap book of it, and it was probably even in a store somewhere. And so I had supplements on all kinds of stuff. I had the box set for playing like biblical era Middle East. I had a book of pirates. I had a book on like deities that are powered by their believers, and all of those things kind of came together in the games that I was running. And frankly, most of those ideas, like, buy an entire splat book for $20 or whatever, read through it and be amazed by all these ideas. And then it would last for about 2 sessions, and then we'd move on to something else anyway. But
did you find yourself having a little bit of system ADD or setting ADD or
like yes and no. Subsystem, I guess. Subsystem I'm gonna call it AD.
We're talking about
now.
Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
I know. I'm gonna call it, yeah. But like there was definitely, because it was D20, it was kind of nice. Most of these things were relatively low lift to drop into another game, and so we would just kind of keep on dropping in these pieces. So like probably one of the longest games that I ran are kind of, there was a meta plot, or not, let's not call it a plot. There was no like desired resolution, but the concept of the game was the player characters had found this deity that was basically dying because it didn't have followers, and they became basically proselytizers to power up this deity to save the world. A little bit of Final Fantasy in there, which, a
little American Gods.
That I got to later, but yeah. So that was kind of the overall thing. But and sorry, the other important part of this was that it was kind of sort of Spelljammer at the same time. There were like flying ships, and we could go to kind of different plane/worlds to some degree, which gave us a lot of permission to, whichever thing I had just been reading would totally be the next thing we played. And so for a while, it was kind of swashbuckling pirates, because I got, I think it was called Skull and Bones or something. It was Green Ronin maybe, or one of those companies. It was a pretty decent supplement. It had some cool stuff, but instead of actually like playing pirates, we just like ripped off little pieces of those rules and sprinkled them into this game, and then forgot about them about 3 sessions later.
That's funny.
And so we did that for all kinds of stuff. I still actually have a lot of my D20 stuff on the shelf behind me, and occasionally I'll look back through it and I'm like, what am I ever going to do with this again? But I mean, it's not most of my D20 stuff. Most of that
Right.
got given away, but there's still a few things there that I'll probably still never use, but at least have like fond memories of, especially some of the late period D20. There was a late Wizards of the Coast book actually that was all alternate magic systems, like one class per. And so
cool.
there were some that were like kind of enchanter type things. There was take on the warlock kind of like at will spellcasting, and this was all just like all in one book, released really pretty late in their 3.5 by then product cycle. And it had so many great ideas. Like someday, I've always told myself that someday I'm going to turn some of those into Dungeon World playbooks. But I am probably the sole audience for that. So yeah.
So how about now? And I know this, Sage, because I've listened to some of your podcast and read a few things that you've put out there. So you've explained to me, and I understand your love of what I call the softer side, which I hate the term, but I haven't come up with a better one, right? The role playing aspect of role playing games. But you also seem to have a definite interest in the crunch aspect of it too, the mechanical aspect of it as well. Where does that come from?
I mean, so part of it comes from my background. Like, I like have a degree in computer. Well, I have 2 degrees in computer science, and I work with computers all the time. So like that kind of system design and probability to some point. I had to take probability in college and was awful at it, like awful. But when it came to discrete probability, it all made sense because I was thinking of dice. All those things kind of come together. And I think part of it for me is that without the mechanical aspects of it, there's less of a springboard. Like, if even with folks that I really like gaming with, if we just sat around and tried to do the fireside, like I guess my wife's family calls them beep stories because you beep when you're done and the next person takes over. That wouldn't be nearly as fun. Like there's something about providing some constraints on it that actually makes it more interesting to me than if this was just a wide open, say whatever you want and that's what happens. And so those, I guess, finding the mesh between those, finding the ways that mechanics can drive the fiction and that fiction can drive the mechanics, because that is, as far as I can tell, pretty much the unique thing in role-playing games, like that feedback cycle, and finding the different ways to plug into that. And we've already mentioned Vincent Baker several times, but his insights into Apocalypse World are part of what really crystallized that for me. Until then, I think I didn't quite understand this as well, and over time, through Vincent's work and John as kind of an interpreter of it, I've at least come to my own understanding of it, and it gives me a lot more appreciation, honestly, for even games that are maybe surprising to some people that I'd be excited about. I'm a huge fan of early editions of D&D, for example. Which sometimes surprises people. And I'm always kind of like, really? Like, I co-created an entire game that's like a love letter to D&D. What did you think I was into?
Yeah.
Like high randomness stuff like Dungeon Crawl Classics. I love lots of messy dice mechanics and all that stuff. Right now, I've been playing in the longest game I've played in for years, probably since I've had kids, and I'm playing The One Ring.
No kidding.
Yeah, like it is a game that, on the one hand, has a lot of things that you would look at and be like, oh, Sage would love that, but it also has a lot of things that you'd look at and be like, Sage is going to bounce off this real hard. And indeed, I played it once and bounced. Like I ran a game for my old gaming group, John and Paul and Shannon, and it didn't work for us. We played about 3 sessions and we're just like, why, this isn't for us. And now I'm playing with some good old friends. Like this is a silver lining on being in a pandemic, so that I get more online gaming and means I get to reconnect with folks. And we play every weekend, and we're about halfway through the huge Darkening of Mirkwood campaign, and I love that system.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and so
a slightly successful Kickstarter for
geez.
Free League.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I contributed my part to that Kickstarter. Even though by the time they ship anything, we will probably be almost done with the Dark Kingdom of Mirkwood, I looked at it and was like, I've had such a good time with this game. I can't not do it.
Well, and I'm a shill for Free League. I love. I'm relatively new to their work, and everything I'm coming across, whether it be Forbidden Lands or Aliens or anything, I'm just like, boy, they are putting out some quality stuff.
Yeah.
It's impressive. So, out of curiosity, you kind of touched on it a little bit, Sage, but when you think of gaming, is there any non-RPG gaming that you enjoy? Is there board games that you enjoy, or anything along those lines? Is it pretty much RPGs?
Oh man, that is a deep rat hole to go down. You mentioned I guess it's still technically my podcast. We haven't produced an episode in a long time, but that was called Another Question, and my co-host there is my good friend Adam, not the Adam from Dungeon World, different Adam, and we play a lot of board games together. He introduced me to the wonders of GMT Games, which is this company that produces very heavy war games. So in particular, we just played through a game of Here I Stand, which is my absolute favorite game. It is a huge, complex, asymmetric board game of the wars of religion around the Reformation. And so you have the English, the French, the Habsburgs, the papacy, the Protestants, and the Ottomans all pursuing victory. There are some things that are common between them. There's some control points on the board, and there are some things that are unique to each of them. So like the French really just want to make art and have awesome chateaus. And so they can spend one of their actions just being like, make some art. And if you're the Pope, you can work on building St. Peter's and just being very papal. And the interactions are all... This was one of the tightest games we've ever had. We had several factions that were like vying for the lead until the Ottomans managed to auto win. And anyway, once you get me talking about board games, it's almost as bad as role playing games.
Oh, that's funny. GMT,
yeah.
that's some hardcore shit right there, man.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's not like Settlers Catan. Like that's some serious board gaming.
Oh yeah, yeah. Their series that first got me interested there is the Coin series, which are all counterinsurgency games. That, I mean, on the one hand, on a kind of like moral personal level, some of the ideas behind the idea of counterinsurgency are problematic to me, but the games are amazing in giving me some amount of empathy, even for the sides that I would not normally pursue, because they're set up asymmetrically so that this isn't just a combat game of like, I'm a poppy farmer and you're the government and you're going to burn down my fields and I'm going to try and fire guns at you. It's actually, well, I'm a poppy farmer. All I care about is making money and being able to support my people. And all this political unrest is bad for that. And so, I don't care too much who's actually winning. I just want my money, which comes usually with stability. And then each other faction hooks into that in different ways. And so, the one that I'm alluding to here is A Distant Plain, which is Afghanistan. And so if you're the U.S. government in that game, you are trying to stabilize things and withdraw your forces. So you want to have as few cubes on the board as you can and have things be stable.
Right.
That overlaps somewhat with the warlords, the poppy farmers, who also want stability so they can make money. But you're also in conflict with them in that, like, them making money is likely to upset the control that you're interested in. Anyway, these are all very heavy, interesting games that in some ways have influenced my role-playing game design. They to me, the dynamics there, the point where you point people not quite at each other, but slightly past each other, is a really interesting setup for role-playing games, even if it's not competitive. There's a thing in that you see actually in early D&D design where the different classes are in some ways thinking about different things. Like skills are basically a thief thing to start with. Like that isn't, everybody else is working through here with their own set of tools. And the thief is the only one who can do these certain special roles. And in that sense, you're kind of playing that asymmetric game to a degree. I can understand why in later editions you make it like, well, of course, everybody should have a chance to listen through a door or whatever. But it is really interesting when you have these kind of clear lanes that play into each other indirectly and give that kind of asymmetric feel to the game. If anything, my biggest complaint, I just talked about how much I love third edition, but my biggest complaint is that it's a very like, it's designed the way a computer scientist would design it. It's this very architected, regimented system where everything fits together in a very preset way, which is great, but it also doesn't leave much of that.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because you say that out loud. I'm saying like, yeah, you can almost in 3.5, you can almost see the bracketing, right, of the code as they discreetly backslashed and finished, segment A and went to segment B. That's very interesting, and it's also kind of cool. You talk about your interest and love of early D&D, and then you talk about your love of GMT when D&D came from wargaming, right? So I mean, the marriage and the progress there is absolutely fascinating. That's cool.
Mean, you've actually hit on my secret kind of third interest in between these, which is Kriegspiel. So
I have no idea what that is.
Yeah, that is my chance to be a good guest here, hopefully, and drop some knowledge. So Kriegspiel is the step between chess and D&D, basically. So if you try to draw the most direct influence line to D&D, it runs through early chess in India. That eventually comes to Europe. And Germany starts, not Germany at the time, but I'm going to mess up my historical knowledge here. Whatever. Some generals in Germany start realizing that part of the problem of training officers is that you don't fight that often anymore. And so you need a way to teach strategy without actually being in combat. And so they start using Kriegspiel as a way to do that, which starts out as basically chess with a few modifications. You have like a gridded board and move things around. And then over time, there's kind of a counter argument there called free Kriegspiel, which becomes basically a arbitrated war game where two sides can issue any orders they want, and they will be interpreted by a GM, basically, who will then describe how things turn out and keep on running the war game with rules involved. And right. I say any rule, I'm sure these being like German officers, they're not going to do the like Kobayashi Maru kind of real stretch on that. But basically it becomes something that very closely resembles a role-playing game, and then that plays into kind of further developments, and eventually we get to the war games that Gygax and Arneson were familiar with, and then they start pulling in, like they were familiar with these kind of refereed war games, and that's a big part of where early D&D comes from. It's basically a refereed war game where you've zoomed in down to the person scale instead of the commander. So Arneson's early, not Arneson's early work, but in Braunstein, which was an early kind of scenario / game along these lines, you see people, you can see French Revolution role or wargaming coming together with this kind of like person level, like embodiment of a role and some degree of kind of creative problem solving all here together. So yeah, Kriegspiel is like I've played in several attempts at doing Kriegspiel in various ways, but I think it's a little bit of a forgotten classic. I mean, not that you can't
it sounds hipster as hell, dude. It's like super retro, but that sounds really interesting. Yeah. And one of my other big interests is miniature gaming, miniature war gaming. Malifaux, that type of stuff. And a lot of people that don't understand the history of miniature wargaming don't realize that it used to be a 3-player game, which is exactly what you're talking about, which was you, your opponent, and the arbitrator, the judge, who helped tell the story and actually was a source of resolve within the systems itself. But I've never, now I've got a whole, now my Google's going to blow up as I like learn about this. This is fascinating.
So my suggestion for more on this, because I was not anticipating talking about this and have not done it justice, is Playing at the World by John Peterson. It is kind of the essential text to my mind on all of the flows of design leading up to D&D.
Beautiful.
And so there's that wargaming Kriegspiel kind of thing. That's obviously one of the biggest ones. There's also play by mail games, and diplomacy as well there as kind of like
that's a game.
Yeah, that is a game. And he identifies a couple others, but yeah, and then he does some deep dives on things like the inventiveness of having both a to hit roll and hit points. Most systems up to that point were kind of using one or the other. It was either a, both sides lose X or roll, and if you get over, the other side's destroyed. And neither of those is a great fit for kind of person level dramatic stuff. And so that combination is a major interesting part of why D&D works. It's a wonderful book. He has
I'll link to it in the show notes, man. That sounds really fascinating.
It's
really fascinating.
And he has a new one that is about when people started calling them role-playing games, because obviously when this started, there wasn't a distinction between role-playing game and war game. There were lots of people who said, like, why would I want to play a game with fantasy stuff in it? But that was the objection, not kind of the, this is a role-playing game. So you've got a really interesting, the title there implies there's this shift that's hard to pin down, where we kind of grew a new thing out of these existing things. And I find all of John's research incredibly interesting. And it's always led me to this main question that at some point I need to send John and see if he'll maybe tackle it in one of his future books. I've always wondered if there's any kind of parallel development here. For pretty much every role-playing game that you or I or pretty much anybody who listens to this is aware of will have been created either directly derived from D&D or with at least knowledge of D&D. And it seems like there must be somebody out there who has come up with a similar idea at some point, and in some sort of parallel development that didn't have the same commercial success in the English speaking world, because that's pretty much what I'm going to know. So yeah, this has always been kind of my like white whale research project, is what parallel development is there out there?
Yeah, talk about stuff I've never thought about, Sage. Like that's a great point. Like I wonder, like, is there? Wow, that's interesting, because wargaming exists when you go to Eastern culture, right? I mean, or Middle Eastern culture. I mean, that's where chess comes from, right?
Yep.
And so, God, that's really fascinating. Like, are there, where did role playing, like, it had to have happened, right? And it just never, never formed up and never came together and launched an entire industry. But I would imagine with enough research, Sage, you could find the seeds, right?
Depending on like how far back you want to go, like which branching point do you want to take? Like if we were talking about something through most of Europe and Asia, you would probably actually have some knowledge of chess or one of the chess derivatives as a starting point, that if this was a role-playing game that looks kind of like what we're used to with a lot of fighting and stuff, it would almost certainly have some circumstantial link to chess. Whereas one of the best leads that I've had that I've been unable to pursue is there are some Native American storytelling games that seem to have some, there's a difference between a storytelling game that's kind of the like pass the stick kind of thing versus something that has some constraints on where the story has to go.
Structure, yeah.
Yeah, some structure. I found a few threads that suggest that there are some games like this. And I grew up in the Southwest. I've always wanted to be able to like go back there and spend some time and like hopefully do this in a way that is respectful of people. I don't want to, my understanding is that some of these games may also feel like important cultural things that, aren't things to be shared with an outsider casually. And so, anyway, this is all my kind of, if I win the lottery and I can just put my money to whatever purpose I want, I'm going to fund research into like the parallel development of this stuff.
Like, you've totally got my wheels turning. So now I'm thinking your lineage concept, right? I'm smoking what you're growing right now. So like, then I think, okay, so if we think Western culture chess, right? And we think about that line and how that line led to the wargaming, led to, H.G. Wells, right? I mean, all of H.G. Wells is the creator of miniature games. That's home. That started from chess and him wanting to expand on the concepts of chess. Then we go parallel to that and we say, well, then there's Go. And think about Go as it being so different, right? And so if you take Go as the basis, where does that lead? And how does that change how we think about things? Oh Christ, this is cool.
Yeah, no, and like
cool.
have people done that? Like there's a lot of kind of cultural I want to say anthropology, but that may not be quite the right domain. But like there's a lot of study of different even living cultures that would be really interesting here that I'm ill-equipped to do. But I hope that someday somebody will pursue this idea and explore the parallels there. Like this feels, this may be too big of an idea for me to really support, but it feels like there is something kind of fundamentally human about this kind of wanting to pretend and share stories in a generated way. Yeah. And so, I would imagine that Gygax and Arneson weren't the only people who got to the point of wanting to add a procedural element to kind of a fictional situation and then see what the outcome is. I'm just not sure who else did it.
Well, and think about this too, because and there's people that may not realize this, and this in no way takes away from what Gygax and him made, right? But they kind of backed into role playing. Yes. And they really did it because their players pushed them there. And a lot of people don't realize that. Like, they were war gamers. They liked playing war games, and Chainmail was their attempt to make war games. And then people pushed them to say, like, we want to tell some stories, and like, if we want to like loosen things up a little bit and stuff like that. And if you go back and you read about the progress of where D&D came from, and again, I'm not taking anything away from what they did, but they kind of backed into it, and they were kind of pushed into it in its own way, which is fascinating in and of itself, right? And again, to your point, that parallel.
Yeah, the D&D as a role-playing game is as emergent as the gameplay of D&D is in a lot of ways. Yes. Like there's a degree of emergence here of a genre as well from the starting ideas. And oh man, this is going to sound bad because it compares me and Adam and Gygax and Arneson, which is not my actual intention in terms of like quality of contribution or size of contribution. But the thing that we found with Dungeon World is definitely there are some ideas that end up being kind of lightning in a bottle. That was a phrase that a friend of mine used that has always stuck with me because I've come to terms with the fact that anything that I do after Dungeon World is likely not going to be anywhere. I mean, nothing I've done so far has been as big. Nothing I do ever again may be as big. And I'm cool with that now because I've realized that some ideas, you're just, the right people in the right place at the right time with the right idea, and everything comes together and it all hits, it clicks. And to some degree, that is Dungeons and Dragons. Like it doesn't take away anything from the quality of the work or the significance of the work, but there's, that same idea landing with a different group of people at a different time. Like Gygax, for example, is very connected with all these gaming scenes, basically, sending letters into magazines and publishing his opinions there and everything. And that without that connection, that game probably would have stayed in Arneson's basement. Yeah.
Well, and it connects to Dungeon World too, which we're going to get into it. I don't want to spoil that, but like, without the work that Meg and Vincent were doing, and the fact that you and Adam had a connection to the early stages of the work that they were doing, we wouldn't have Dungeon World in the way it is, right? And we could attribute a lot of that to just you backing into that too, right? And being lucky that you were there when you were there and connected the way you were connected, and that doesn't take away from the work that you guys did. And sometimes people struggle with admitting that they were lucky or in the right place at the right time because it can often feel threatening. Like, well, that doesn't, I worked hard. Like what you guys made with Dungeon World took a lot of heart and soul, but both can exist at the same time. You can say, you know what, we were lucky, we were in the right place at the right time, and we worked our asses off and we created some good shit. And both of those things can be true at the same time.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I kind of led here with the story about meeting John Harper. Like, if it weren't the fact that my aunt happened to be friends with his girlfriend at the time, I would have moved out here. I probably would have never encountered those folks. Through meeting John Harper, I heard about the small local convention that he kind of helped organize, Go Play Northwest. And it was at Go Play Northwest that I met Adam Coble. And we started collaborating on Dungeon World because, this is kind of the not so secret history of Dungeon World. It started out as Apocalypse D&D, a game by Tony Dowler. And so at that Go Play Northwest, Tony ran Apocalypse D&D for me. And at the time, it was like 10 pages of single-sided Word document printed out and a D&D player's handbook. And some of his maps, because he's an artist. He did art for Dungeon World. And I thought it was so great. I was like, do you have another print off of this so that I can run it later? And so I ended up running it for Adam Coble and some of his friends who were down from Vancouver. And afterwards, I basically asked Tony, like, can I think I started out with like, just can I make some playbooks for this, some character sheets? Because at the time, you just kind of wrote, there were some rules and you kind of made it up as you went. And as I was making the character sheets, I decided it needed to stand alone a little bit more. I couldn't, be referencing, get out your AD&D player's handbook. And then eventually figured out that, putting the name Apocalypse D&D on it was a problem.
Problematic.
So, we kept on developing from there. And I think I tweeted out some early pictures and Adam was like, this looks really cool. Do you want feedback on it? And I was like, yeah.
Something.
And then we started collaborating more and more. And like at the time, both of us had jobs that were not eating up a lot of our daytime hours. And so we would spend a lot of time emailing back and forth on debating Dungeon World design ideas, basically. And
fascinating.
We do that for a lot of our day. And then, eventually we got to the point where we're like, hey, we should kickstart this. And we thought our audience was, we were both active on a forum called Story Games. And we thought our audience was mostly people from that forum. We were expecting, if we were lucky, a few hundred people. And so we set what we thought was a little bit of an aggressive funding goal. And we launched the campaign one morning before I drove to work. So like I basically hit launch campaign and then walked out the door and drove to work. And I had about a 20, 30-minute commute. By the time I got to work, it was fully funded.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, we immediately were like, oh my gosh, it turns out a lot more people have heard of our game than we thought.
And now we got to make the stupid game.
Yeah. Like we were in a situation where we had most everything nailed down, but there were, it was interesting. There was a few small, things that felt small, but were actually very big to the overall feel of the game that we decided relatively late. So like one of those that stuck in my mind is how to deal with damage from multiple monsters, because we're not D&D. We don't have kind of like turn order where each monster is going to take a specific number of attacks.
No initiative. Yeah.
There's no initiative. So you have to have some idea of, you're fighting 3 wolves, 3 like werewolves, whatever. And how is that different than fighting 1 werewolf? Is it you're facing a modifier to your rolls? When you take damage, how much more damage are you taking? And we kind of went back and forth on different ways to do this. And that ends up implying a lot of tone to the game, because we ended up with something that scales damage pretty loosely for a large number of creatures, which tended to make Dungeon World feel much more kind of heroic or super heroic, because you can wade into a bunch of goblins and each one's not adding that much damage. You're probably good, especially if you've picked up a little bit of damage reduction in some way or decent set of armor. And so that was actually a relatively late decision in the game. We had a lot of the overall like class architecture and stuff locked in. We had most of the abilities. We had played a lot, and we just kept on going back and forth on this little thing that we felt like was this little remaining design problem, but in a lot of ways was saying what kind of game this is.
How does it
and
feel?
so, yeah. Now when I do design, I'm much more aware of how some of these small decisions are actually some of your biggest decisions in a lot of ways. There was also a lot of discussions there that flew over my head a little bit about the some of the kind of implicit biases and stuff of Dungeons and Dragons and how much are we tackling those? At the time, the game I'm still proud of. It's as good as progressive a game as I could make at the time. But looking back on it, there are a lot of things that now I'm like, yeah, we've got like hordes of orcs and stuff, and that is not where I'd want to do things now.
And I actually, I'm glad you bring that up because I want to do a segment on that, Sage, because I think it's very, very a very fascinating discussion, and you are an incredible test case for this discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick break. When we get back, I'm going to rewind a little bit because there's some origins of Dungeon World I want to delve a little bit deeper on that you kind of glossed over, and I'm not going to let you get away with that. So we're going to talk about the making of Dungeon World, where Dungeon World came from, how the pieces all came together. But I'm also going to come back to what Sage started to bring up because it's a fascinating subject. We'll be right back.
If you're an athlete, you know the greatest motivator of all is the fear of letting your teammates down. After all, a team is only as good as its weakest link. So you owe it to those wearing the same jersey as you to be your best every time you step on the field. That's why there's no vape in team. When you vape, you can expose your lungs to toxic chemicals that can damage your lungs. If you're a step behind, the team's a step behind. Brought to you by The Real Cost and the FDA.
Hi, I'm Keith Suderman, and I'm a patron of Third Floor Wars. You'll never mistake me for a competitive player, but I really enjoy the analysis and the advice I get from Tabletop Talk. You should be a patron too. Head on over to patreon.com and search for Third Floor Wars, or just click the link in the show notes below.
Right now is the part of many podcasts where someone comes on, interrupts the show, and explains that you should consider paying for the content you're already getting for free. They'll go on and explain that by giving $1 or more a month, you not only support the show, but you allow the show to grow and improve. Here on the Third Floor, we commit to not interrupting your episode of Tabletop Talk with such a plea. We pledge not to run a spot asking you to go to patreon.com and give $1 or more a month. Even if there's a link in this show's description, and there is, we won't ask you to click it and become a patron. We won't spend time yammering about the benefits like early access to episodes, getting those episodes without ad breaks, or even getting a chance to play in one of Craig's RPG sessions. Anyway, enjoy this episode. We needed to clarify that we wouldn't do this type of solicitation. I'd like to take a moment to give a shout out to some of the original patrons that started us on this journey. Special thanks to Jesse Ellis, Sam Newman, Nick Westbrook, Jim Ortiz, Kevin Smith, Keith Suderman, Matthew Riddle, Dane Leargard, Jeremy Peace, Bookie Gunner, Chris Blue, Vaslav, Kim Otto Nielsen, Rolf Randall, John Haas, Cody Hyatt, Michael Roper, Ambrose Ingram, Pudgy Hobbit, Kaiser and Crimson, Brandon Sommer, Jason Reddy, Jason Burry, Kylie Woodland, Brian Schooner, Alan Volts, and Owen. Because of you and the 100 other plus patrons, I'm able to put out content on a regular basis, and I appreciate it. So we spoiled it a little bit, Sage, kind of where Dungeon World came from, but I want to go backwards just a little bit. So was your first exposure to Apocalypse World mechanics that one word page document, or had you smelled it before?
No, I was lucky enough to have some of the very earliest print editions of Dungeon World, or sorry, Apocalypse World. I had some of the earliest print editions of Dungeon World too, but that one's less surprising.
That's good. I'm glad you did.
Yeah, the earliest print editions of Apocalypse World, thanks to mostly John Harper. So, this is, again, one of those things where I was very lucky. And this is, in a lot of ways, the difference with a lot of designers who don't get the recognition and credit that they should, that they happen to not have family who introduced them to John Harper because they think that all role-playing games are the same. I really lucked into something there, and then, John knows Vincent, and so got, I think I still have it back there on my shelf. There's a very early release of Apocalypse World where the covers are made out of something that the print shop just had laying around. Some each one is a little different, and then a real simple tape binding basically, and each I forget what they call them, each set of pages is kind of clearly a separate set of pages.
Yep.
And so that early Ashcan edition was John Harper went to some convention down in Portland, I believe, and came back with one of these for each of us and was like, here's Vincent's new thing.
So you get a bootleg copy of Apocalypse World, and I guess my first question is, did you actually play it?
Yeah, we played, though, mostly shorter games. The funny thing is, across all this time, I've played a lot of Apocalypse World, but mostly very short games, even, 1 or 2 session kind of games.
Do you have a sense why that is?
I think part of it is that the system definitely shines early.
Yeah.
I don't think it actually diminishes later on, but it's a game that delivers so soon that you don't necessarily have to play a lot of it.
That's true.
I mentioned earlier playing the One Ring, and that was definitely several sessions in before it really felt like the game was running on all cylinders, kind of.
Yeah.
Whereas, most Apocalypse World games that I've played, 5-10 minutes in, everything's rolling. There's something about the leading questions and the playbooks and the setups that come out of them that just gets you moving so quickly, and tend to push things towards pretty dramatic situations early on.
Yep.
And part of it also is probably just the my gaming schedule. Yeah, not too long after Dungeon World was published, I changed jobs and had a lot less free time during the day at work, and then eventually, not too much longer after that, my first daughter was born, and I definitely pivoted towards I don't know how often I can game, let's just fit in what we can.
Yep.
And so a lot of games that I've played have been 1 to 2 sessions. But, Apocalypse World definitely showed up really well in those first early sessions, and it made me pretty excited when I heard Tony had this Apocalypse D&D pitch.
So I'd be curious, Sage, coming from the role-playing games before that, I'd be very interested if you can remember. It might be hard to, because it's been such an integral part of your creative process. But do you remember your first impressions? Because it was radical, absolutely radical, what Vincent and Meg put out there. What do you remember what it was like the first time you saw it?
Oh, man. The funny thing is, the thing that stands out to me the most are the misconceptions that I had even relatively far into Dungeon World development.
Interesting.
So, for example, I really didn't get moves from the GM's perspective, GM moves. I kind of, got the overall idea, but then when it came to monsters, at first every monster had a player facing move. That was part of our monster template, was every monster had something about when you stare into the eyes of a Medusa, roll +1, and a lot of them were just thin, weak moves. But it was
because you had to make one.
Because you had to make one. And it was kind of how, I felt like monsters had to have things that made them special. And so, now I think I have a better, I kind of thought that was the way for the GM to effectively describe something in the fiction, was to give it a new move. And that is a good way for a GM to describe that, but it is not the most economical or a quick one. And it doesn't scale up to kind of bestiary size things, which, there's
Right.
there's a question to be said of should we have had that many monsters in Dungeon World, but I think the monsters get across a lot of the tone. Like
Yep.
the writing there is evocative. Yeah.
No, it very much is, and it takes a while to digest Apocalypse World, and what listeners already know, but you don't, is I discovered all of this a year ago because I took 20 years off from role playing, so I stopped playing role playing games in my early 20s. And then came back to it a year and a half ago. And I was like, holy shit, what have you people been doing while I was gone? Some things have changed. And I remember my first time digesting Apocalypse World and, missing a lot of it. And Megan Vincent on the interview did a great job of helping me understand it a lot. But the GM moves was one of them where I was just like, well, why are we limiting the dungeon master that way or the game master that way? But then you start digging into it a little bit. You understand what was happening there. So you're exposed to that Apocalypse World. You play it a little bit. You start to digest it, understand it. Then you sit down and you play this D&D Marriage, Apocalypse Dungeons and Dragons. You run into Adam, you run it for Adam, emails start coming back and forth. At what point, like if we were to forensically go back and do the kind of research you're going to do on parallel role playing, if we were to go back, do you think that there was a moment where both you and Adam realized, I think we're going to make a game?
Oh man. There might have been, and it might have been different for each of us. Because
Right.
Adam and I are actually very different people. Like the fact that we ended up working together is I don't know, what is it? Like the Mythbusters guys kind of hate each other, but they I mean, Adam and I probably don't hate each other, but we're definitely
No, I get what you're saying, though. Yeah.
an odd couple in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so, it's interesting because there's this phase of my life that was emailing with Adam several times every day. And we were in that sense really close, but we're also like, especially once Dungeon World got out the door, we drifted apart pretty quick. Like
Yeah.
we in some ways didn't have a lot in common other than this creative effort. But because of that, I don't know, if I dug back, the funny part is it's all in Gmail. So I still have all of it. There may have been a point where there's that email that says like, I think we're making a game. But to me, at least looking back on it without, actually looking it up, I'm pretty sure it's when we started getting more and more stories of people playing kind of all over the world. The one that sticks with me the most, and I wish I could remember this guy's name to kind of give him credit. If I remember correctly, he was an Australian ambulance driver, and he sent us, or I forget whether he posted on the forum or sent us an email, basically saying like, I forget how he even heard about Dungeon World. I think it was, somewhat plugged into indie role-playing games. He had gone, I think, on a camp out with some friends because he didn't get that much time off. And it was really, this was like a really important chance to get to reconnect with some old friends. And he had taken Dungeon World and like played it around a campfire or something.
Yeah.
And he just told us like, this was like, it was what brought me back together with these old friends, and it made it feel like when we had the time to do this. I'm probably not doing his story justice, but at least this is my recollection of it. And that kind of experience for folks was the point where I realized that I definitely wanted to do this, mostly because I guess my kind of net metric for Dungeon World is I want it to be a net positive. And like when I think about some of the things that I would go back and change, especially around some of the biases built into the game inherited from D&D,
Yep.
I've thought long and hard about, is this something that I still want to have out there? Like, Adam and I have basically both of us have to agree to do things, and I'm not sure how it'd work if one of us, absolutely felt something had to happen. But I've never pushed it because the thing that I end up at is I think even with those things, we're probably still a net positive for folks overall. And by being a net positive for people, hopefully a net positive in the world. And those kinds of stories were I don't know. They make me feel better than the royalty checks.
Well, I mean, that's got to be a struggle, man. Like, I mean, especially when you have an awareness of what of things that you identify now as the creator, that you go back and go, that's problematic. And and then you have to go through that. I would imagine, like, I don't know how to put this, man. The struggle to understand where you were back then and how much of it was conscious, subconscious, and how much was it innocent, for lack of a better word, but not necessarily absolving yourself. That's some complicated shit, man. That's some complicated shit.
Yeah, and intentions don't matter in the larger world, but to how I view myself and how I view what I need to do going forward, my intentions matter such, at least in how intentions matter and how I can do better. And the thing that I felt pretty, even looking back on it, I believe that my intentions were good and that I was moving things forward as much as I understood them at the time. The understanding that I've gained since then has been pretty tremendous. And I think I'm actually skipping ahead topics again. So like, I don't want to steal.
That's okay, man. No, that's good. And I think part of it from the outside point of view, Sage, is in doing that, you've owned your shit, which I appreciate, because that's not easy to do. I struggle with that. And Dungeon World was made at a different time, and it was made by a different person than I'm interviewing right now. But that, and for you to identify and understand that there are problems, I own those problems, and I own I have learned from that, and I have more to learn, right? So you don't out there proclaiming I've figured it all the fuck out. Like, all of that matters, right? Mm-hmm. And one thing you can't do is go back 10 years and rewrite Dungeon World. So, but at the same time, Dungeon World changed role-playing games, and brought a lot of people, and still brings a lot of people a lot of joy. So yeah, that's a lot to deal with, man.
Yeah. This is, especially in the past year or so, it's been on my mind a lot, and it's it's a lot to unpack. And like that, the in some ways the most interesting part of the Dungeon World journey has been what to do with a success. Like the development process, I don't know, there's plenty of like interesting anecdotes along the way, and times that I floated ideas that were absolutely awful and rightfully got, what are you thinking? And then there were long threads about things that ended up not actually mattering, and whatever, like lots of that. But I feel like I'm so lucky to have this experience of getting to know what it's like to kind of have that lightning in a bottle moment, to have this successful thing and be able to see where it goes, and like all of the wonderful people that it's brought me into contact with. And like all the stories from folks about, this game helped me connect with my kids. This game brought back memories of my childhood. This game, just was a good time on a Friday night with beer and pretzels. Like I really admire people like Vincent Baker and Meg Baker and just Morningstar, and a ton of other designers who can make games that are interrogating tougher subjects and are really moving important conversations forward, I think, in a lot of ways. I'm not as skilled at that, and like I've kind of had to come to the realization that
good
like
that you understand that, though. That's huge.
My niche, both in the games that I most gravitate towards playing and the games that I'm best at making, is definitely a bit more on the beer and pretzel side of things, and that doesn't like absolve me from any of the design or setting things there. Like, it just means that my goal is going to be, for the most part, like kind of light entertainment that is as, I don't know, I often think of it as palatable as possible, because like what I think of there is, if you take something like, I mentioned playing The One Ring, Tolkien is kind of like deeply problematic in the othering of basically everybody evil.
He's not kind of, Sage.
Yeah.
He is, right?
Yeah.
He is. Let's be honest. And as is H.P. Lovecraft, right?
And Lovecraft is like a whole other
But at the same time, that doesn't mean that what they created doesn't have value. And it can't be taken. There's people that listen to my Dennis Detwiller interview who made Delta Green. He talks about, taking H.P. Lovecraft and saying, you know what, you racist piece of shit. I'm going to make something else using your stuff. And that's what a lot of people do with Tolkien too. Yeah.
Well, and like the Tolkien, it's interesting. Like Tolkien as provides a backdrop for especially in the movie adaptations, like a fantasy adventure. Like there's a ton of problematic stuff that goes into that, and then out of it you get. I just rewatched Lord of the Rings recently, and like it still holds up in so many ways. It's fun to watch, even when I look at the depiction of the orcs in particular, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to like this, but like it's super entertaining. And then like you look at something like Star Wars, specifically A New Hope, just to like narrow it down, because Star Wars can mean a lot of things, and it's still, there are certainly problematic things like blowing up the Death Star. Is that a justifiable act? But at least the bad guys there are people who are identified by what they are doing and what they are wearing, as opposed to like the shape of their bodies. And the rank and file, we have some, how culpable are you? Most of the Empire forces that are seen getting blown up are in the process of doing something actively harmful, which again, kind of like there's to me that becomes a easier thing to enjoy, and that like I can kind of look at it and be like, this certainly isn't a role model for how to live your life, but it at least is providing some justification for these things that's a little easier to support.
Correct. And I think there's a couple things there, Sage. One, I mean, there's the Kevin Smith, there were some Union guys on the Death Star that died, right? Which we laugh at, but he's in typical Kevin Smith way. He's doing two things at once. And it ties to what we've talked about a little bit. All of this can exist at the same time, right? Yeah. So we can go back to Tolkien and we can praise him and say, holy, like, hey, congratulations, you invented an entire form of fiction. Like, that's kind of a big freaking deal, right? And you gave people a place to go and a place to create and a place to build off of. I mean, I just got done talking, calling Tolkien a racist. I think I called H.P. Lovecraft was worse, but Tolkien had problems, right? And we can say he was a product of his time, which doesn't excuse anything. It explains some things, and I think that one of the battles I'm having, Sage, I guess I shouldn't talk about this as general. Let's talk about me for a second. It's my fucking podcast. Like, I'm struggling with the fact that it's not black and white, and several things can be true at the same time. H.P. Lovecraft is problematic, and he changed how stories are told, and both of those things can be true. We can look at H.P. Lovecraft and go, he was an amazing artist who created worlds and concepts that change everything, and he was kind of a racist piece of shit. And all of that can be true. And that's hard to convey on Twitter. That's hard to, and it's real easy to be draconian about it. And it's a lot harder to try to find space for all of that. Is that making any sense?
Yeah, it is. And I think it's interesting to even go a step beyond that. Like, it's interesting to me to try to figure out how much of, or in what ways, because how much implies there's like a quantity of racism that I can measure or something. Right. But like, in what ways?
I've got four racism.
Yeah. I mean, the scale there. Oh man, we really got to define the scale. Yeah. What about, let's say Lovecraft? Because I think he was kind of the more virulent here, is showing through in his work in a way that actually not just it's true that both of these things are true, but potentially even led to some of the recognition of his work. I think this is probably a bit of a stretch, but there are some of his stories that I certainly read as his anxieties about his perceived dangers of, I mean, basically dark-skinned people, and pasting those into a cosmic horror, and is a portion of why that resonated with some of his earlier readers, that they shared that, and like how do we deal with the legacy that comes with that.
That's very true.
And
very
yeah,
true.
it's like this is stuff that I think about a lot, and like I think the best thing that I've been able to come up with since I've been lucky enough to have this kind of lightning in a bottle experience and have a relative platform here is to use that to hopefully amplify the voices of others. And like I have a late start here in a way, just from being a straight white guy raised in America. I try to do the work and everything, but I am not the kind of person that should be like leading the charge here. And so, I find these things very interesting because I obviously think about analyzing media a lot, as we've seen for our conversation so far. But like, ultimately this is the kind of thing that I hope people smarter than me find ways to engage with and, hopefully reach people with. You're completely right. Fitting this into a tweet is not very practical. But
well, and it's one of the things that like in my journeys, right? Because spoiler alert, I'm a old white guy too. Like one of the things that I've been trying to do is as soon as I think everybody has that initial pushback emotion, that fight of the fight and flight reaction, right? And one of the things that I've been doing is like when I see something that causes me to want to defend, like that urge to defend, like I'm now learning to start as soon as I feel that going, wait a second, where is that coming from? And what am I really defending, right? Mm-hmm. Like what is really happening here? And that's helped me in that progress as well. And I would imagine for you, Sage, because people have come at Dungeon World, and you have had to have those times where you're like, whoa, like that reaction, right? Yeah. At your creation being attacked and being able to sort through that. Like, did you find yourself? Well, let's not even talk about some of the heavier shit we're talking about. Like, people got Dungeon World when it first came out and said it was garbage. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And what was your reaction to that? And I'm talking like they just said it was a shitty game, right? Not that it was tropey.
Yeah. So my reaction to that, it was actually to collect all of the worst reviews about him and turn them into a page on my old site. I don't think it's live anymore, called Praise for Dungeon World. And so it's still, at least last I checked, available in the Internet Archive. I don't think I have a live copy of it anymore, partially because some of the people who said awful things are people who I didn't want to be repeating their words, even if it was, even if the ones about Dungeon World were just, awful. So, we got stuff like it's Gramscian socialism in game form.
Phenomenal.
Yeah, like people had strong reactions, and part of that is due to RPG scene politics, for lack of a better. I mentioned we were active on the story games forums, and there was people who viewed that as pretentious. There were certainly all their actual problems with it. I don't think pretentiousness was top 5 or 10. And so, coming out of that and being related to Apocalypse World and all these things, like it came with some amount of identification that certainly led people to take the game a certain way. This actually runs through a lot of things that I do, both game design and kind of my day job and my personal life. For whatever reason, I'm a person who's very okay with tough criticism, I guess, and just kind of rolling with that and trying to take what I can that's actually actionable out of it, and just kind of letting the rest of it, to some degree, yeah.
Now that's a learned skill in my experience, Sage. Was that a learned skill for you, or do you think there's something inherently that's allowed you to be that way? Because I had to learn it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it must be learned, and I wish that I could think of more where I got that.
That's calling your mom.
Yeah, calling home. Actually, the funny part is, I was talking about my friend Isaac, who introduced me to role playing games and did art for Dungeon World. To some degree, I would give him a lot of credit for this. Actually, he one time early on, we were doing a group project kind of thing together, and we were having a really contentious high schooler debate about how to do something. And Isaac just, everybody kind of I was one of the people who was very engaged trying to figure out, what is the best way to do this. And Isaac just said, whatever, I'll go with the flow. And at the time, this was such a weird idea to me. And the thing that I ended up taking out of it was that not everything I do has to be seen as a judgment on me.
Interesting.
I was very invested in being right in this conversation and being a reflection on me. And, Isaac's, I mean, I don't think he probably even meant half of this. I think he basically meant I don't care. But part of what I took out of it was, he's not investing personal significance in this, and instead is saying I will move forward from this, and that's the important part. And so I guess between
that's hard.
that and
that's hard though, right? It's hard not to let other people define you, and it's also hard not to let people reframe things for you. All that's some heavy shit, dude. And that's hard to do. And
letting other people define you. I don't think I've ever said this particularly publicly, but about a year ago, there was somebody made a big Twitter thread pointing out problems with Dungeon World, and the actual criticisms were almost all correct. I think there was one missing rules thing there, whatever. Who cares? Overall, very solid points. And I didn't want to undermine that by the one thing that frustrated me, which is at one point, the thread was, a little hyperbolic and made reference to a certain look that they assumed that I had, which doesn't look anything like me. It was pink crystal glass wearing, long pink hair or whatever. That is actually a description of how Adam Koebel looks.
Right.
That is not a description of how I look, even particularly close. And for a year now, it is when I think of that thread, one of the things that actually frustrates me the most is if you're going to drag me on things that I've done, please make sure it's actually me. The points were actually very good, and I've learned a lot from them. But it still bothers me that if this thread got a lot of attention for good reason, and it describes me in a way that just doesn't line up at all.
Well, and stuff like that plagues you too, but and I know exactly which thread you're talking about, because before we started recording, I praised you on your handling of that thread, because I'd like to think I would have been as good as you about handling that.
You would have.
I would have strived to, because I thought you handled it very, very well. But it, it's funny as you say it, because my favorite thing is to go to iTunes and read my bad reviews on this podcast. And it does two things for me. One, it gives me feedback. You know what? You're 99% wrong, asshole, but that 1% is a legit thing. Or it's the opposite, right? Where, they're 99% right, but the 1% thing is that I don't have pink hair. You glean that and you hear that. But also, how do I put this? I love that I'm producing something. Love is a strong word. It's interesting to me to produce something that somebody hates enough to take the time to write a review on iTunes.
Yeah. We're lucky enough to be, kind of both of us, I think, socially secure enough that these threats, these don't become threats. They are not, it is just people being people on the internet, confrontations. And so we're lucky to approach it from that side. But I agree. Like and to some degree, I guess that's part of how I see this is, I guess, a bit of a stretch, but how I see I can use my privilege. I'm in a spot where I can take people being completely ridiculous about this stuff and not have to worry that these people will, take more serious action against me for the most part. And so that kind of, having that perspective is really is a privilege. And like, I agree. Like for a while on, I guess I still have it. I just don't look at it much more. I had a Google alert on Dungeon World, and like the things that I'd most often click on are either if it's like, some relatively big article from a big place, or if it's somebody completely trashing the game. And part of that is even just kind of morbid curiosity. Like how did they come to this conclusion? And sometimes even there's interesting things that are to spot in the misconceptions, the number of people who come to Dungeon World with misconceptions. And part of that is the fact that the book was originally written figuring we were talking to, maybe a few hundred people, most of whom had were relatively connected to us. And now it's gone far
There's some
beyond
casualness in the writing. Yeah.
Yeah, and like so there are things there that are not as clear as they could be. Absolutely. But like it's interesting to see people sometimes using that lack of clarity to bring their own preconceived notions to the game, especially when those notions are colored by some knowledge of Adam or I or kind of our background or the other games we're connected to. And so, and a lot of those early kind of praise for Dungeon World pull quotes that I grabbed were from people who were in some ways reacting more to the other people that we were connected to. I mean, scene, I guess, is how I would tend to phrase it, but that's, community, whatever grouping you want to apply.
Circle or whatever. Yeah.
Was standing out to people, a lot of the people who are really panning the game more so than any specific thing about the rules. And, we kind of made it easy for them. Like, I felt pretty passionate about releasing.
Made it easy for them.
Well, like, in a couple of ways. I mean, first of all, there's the fact that the game
phenomenal. That's just good, Sage. Sorry.
the game makes it a little easy for them, but there's also the fact that, like, I felt pretty passionate about releasing the text of the game under a open license so that people could remix it. But that meant that, like, we were an easy target for people who wanted to rail against this because they didn't have to buy a copy. They could go and look at the, basically SRD versions of it and read over it and pick out a few things that they wanted to trash on them. And, if you're getting paid by the ad on your site, that's a little cheaper than going out and actually buying a game.
It is.
And so, like, I think I, in particular, was kind of uniquely... not necessarily uniquely, but like through that, the skills that I've realized I have that have developed over time in being able to deal with feedback like this, it turns out that we made the perfect game for somebody who can take that kind of feedback, and we released it in the perfect way for that. We
Isn't that cool?
We're priced relatively aggressively. We have this open license, so like it's a game that got into the hands of lots of people, and lots of people had strong opinions about it. And what you said about every review means that like a person actually interacted with this and had a strong reaction to that. I really agree. Even the people who do the more like shit soup or shit sandwich kind of reviews for Dungeon World, like they thought about this game more than they probably thought about a lot of things, which, I'm not happy that that's this specific thought that I provoked, but like it is at least a thought-provoking thing.
It is, and I'm going to probably phrase this poorly, so forgive me. And hopefully my point will come through the miasma of my head. Critiquing is easier than creating. Now, that doesn't take away from the value and the importance of critique, because that is extremely important, right? But there is also something about putting something down on the page, releasing a podcast every week, publishing something that is now, because it's gone, right? As soon as I publish this episode between you and I, Sage, it's gone. and you and I can't re-record it. We can't delete it. We can't pretend it didn't happen. Right. There that has its own thing. And you know, and by no means are we victims in that scenario, because we're sitting here freaking doing it. Right. But that is still something as well. And it is in some ways easier to then grab that, bring your own thing in with it, and come at it, and it can't defend itself. And in some cases, it shouldn't defend itself, right? And we're acknowledging that, right? We're not saying that, you know, everything is right and stuff like that. But Dungeon World is never going to vanish. It's always going to be there. And reconciling that as a creator is an absolute real thing. And we are now an hour into this podcast, and I feel like we're shitting on Dungeon World, and I want to stop doing that for a second. Because one of the things that I thought was interesting, and again, I'm putting this in the context of me coming back, right? So I left D&D and GURPS and then found Apocalypse World and Dungeon World and Blades in the Dark, and I'm like, holy shit. Like it blew my mind. And I went through what was really a 10-year revolution and experienced it in a matter of weeks and months, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've been very curious to find out is I believe that when we create, we're trying to solve problems that we perceive. Right. So as much as Dungeon World is an homage to Dungeons and Dragons, it's an homage to especially early Dungeons and Dragons. I would be curious to know, and it may be something that you didn't do consciously, but was there problems that you and Adam saw? We can even talk mechanically or non-mechanically, that you felt like what justifies Dungeon World existing? Sure. I mean, we can go play White Box, right? Mm-hmm. So why does Dungeon World exist? What does Dungeon World do? What does it fix, or what does it present in your mind?
So yeah, let me first talk about Dungeon World, and then I have a larger idea of kind of how this fits into how we conceive progress, for lack of a better word, in role-playing games. So for Dungeon World in particular, part of what we're doing is creating the rules that focus on the parts of D&D that most people think about playing. Because I, for one, love long charts of types of pole arms, but that is typically not the thing that people talk about in their recollections of D&D. And that makes it sound too monolithic, what people recall. But one of the things that people most tend to do is tell, the kind of narrative after the fact of all the events that happened and how they, got sucked into a vortex at the bottom of the ocean and spit out into another dimension and tracked their way back, et cetera, et cetera. Dungeon World tends to cut straight to that. It part of what we borrowed from Apocalypse World is that you primarily talk about what's happening in the world of the game, and the rules kind of step in and nudge you along occasionally, instead of having to do that kind of hard shift to okay, roll initiative. There's a lot of reasons to have initiative. It's a super useful concept, but it also means that there's much more of a step away and invoke the rules as a distinct thing from talking about what our characters are doing. And so by getting people into that flow more, we tend to do more of what they remember from a role-playing game, which is talking about their character and get involved there. And then the rules kind of just step in and step out and interweave with that, as opposed to being a hard context switch. The other thing that I think we're kind of addressing, so more tactically, mechanically, progression in D&D has always been a sticky concept, because on the one hand, the idea of advancement of progression is key to why D&D works. On the other hand, the ways in which D&D has typically scaled have often been slightly either finicky or funky, or the linear warrior progression versus exponential wizard progression kind of thing. It
has scaling problems.
It has scaling problems, and even in the editions or derived games that have slightly better scaling, it often doesn't feel. It doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. To borrow a video game analogy, there was some of the early Elder Scroll games where everything would scale with your level, and it meant that everything kind of always felt the same. Yeah. And D&D has a little bit of that in that, even if we make it feel different to scale up, how do you fit that into a world such that you can have 20 times your starting hit points, and yet you're still walking around next to somebody who has one hit point or whatever. And so kind of looking at how to scale in this, and not that we were the first ones to take on this problem, but like when people, this again goes back to kind of our overall like aim or thesis being more or less how you remember playing D&D, is people remember advancement. They remember getting better over time. Like you can't get rid of that entirely, but they also typically, their most editions kind of had a sweet spot of certain levels worked pretty well, and then some of them didn't. And we wanted to keep you in that sweet spot as much as possible and kind of make some tough decisions about like, this just isn't a game that scales quite as far. We still want there to be that scaling because that's important to the feeling of advancement, but we're not going to go all the way, the 20 level span or whatever.
And was that a conscious decision, or was that something that you think was more organic?
That one, I mean, it probably started somewhat organically, but it was ultimately a very conscious one. And something that I think, if anything, we overshot a little bit. So we completely got rid of increases to HP. The amount of HP that you start with, well, sorry, you could change your constitution score and then technically get a little more HP.
Right, but like, you don't go from 10 to 30, right?
You don't go to 10 to 30, and like it doesn't call out. There isn't like a specific level up ability that's like you have more HP now. You kind of have to realize, oh, if I raise my constitution, then I get more HP. If I were to go back, I think I would change that slightly, but still make it a conscious choice. Like part of the challenge to scaling in D&D is that in most editions, it's a very default thing. Every level, your numbers go up, or at least the numbers that your class cares about. And some of them don't go up, or they go up more slowly if they're the ones your class doesn't care about.
Right.
We went like in Dungeon World, we actually still made a little bit of almost a mistake, for lack of a better word, in that your stats do kind of still do that. Like every so often you get it to do a stat bump, and that kind of has that same problem that like you can't scale indefinitely because all those numbers are going to eventually get to a problematic place.
Yep.
On the other hand, we made things like your, gaining new abilities a choice and a conscious choice, and importantly, HP doesn't auto scale, which makes a big difference in how you can approach like what a meaningful opponent is. How much damage is meaningful. In most editions of D&D, by the time you are a few levels in, a dagger is no longer a scary thing. You can literally have somebody just walk up and shiv you, and who cares? Whatever. That's yeah. And we wanted to stay a little away from that. We didn't quite nail it. Like I have ideas for how I'd further fine tune this. So like in particular, bring down the absolute number of HP so that, that dagger is always dangerous, but then allow for increases in HP through specific abilities, but you still have to choose those. It's not a default, like every level kind of thing. So those I think are some of the biggest D&D things. There were also some like, I really didn't want to do drow. Like drow were this is kind of the, as it was as progressive a game as I could be at the time. And that was one thing that I was pretty clear on, like that one just was not a starter for me. So we did a lighter treatment of some similar things. We definitely wanted to find ways to be progressive around sex and gender, while also knowing that our game is not one that is particularly going to involve that. So, how do you...
Interesting.
How do you make a game that is more embracing of a variety of types of people when, Apocalypse World actually puts this front and center and like gives you options there that make you really think about the range of identities that people can have. And Dungeon World, we're a fantasy adventure game. That's not necessarily going to come up. And so we kind of had to think about we don't want to have a like male/female box circle one like that. That is definitely not where we're at. But on the other hand, we're also not a game that's going to give you a whole lot of interaction with that side of your character. And so we ended up, rightly or wrongly, just not having that be a thing on your character sheet. Nothing says, who anything about your physical form other than kind of your species, which even that I'd probably go back and treat differently, and your so nothing like about any kind of gender or nothing about any kind of sexuality, any of that stuff, because that just isn't where our game's operating. And like I hope that that's a thing that makes it more inviting people, because if that is something that is a thing that you immediately envision on your character, you can bring it forward. And if that's something that you don't think of, you don't engage with it.
Well, and you also allow it to change, right?
Yes.
By not defining it, it can change over time, which I think is significant as well.
Yeah. And that is actually something, if I were to go back and redo Dungeon World these days, and I have ideas written down on this, and it's a complicated, it's a complicated thing to approach for a number of reasons now. But I would probably do D&D for awful reasons, calls it race, but basically species in the same way, and call it like form. And like, instead of having specific abilities tied to them, have a list of common fantasy things to try and bring people forward from the, I'm an elf wizard kind of thing. You can still circle elf there. You can still on your wizard playbook. But all it does is say what your physical form is, and whatever, this world of magic, you can recircle another one later on. And there's probably a blank spot there too, because, I personally didn't really like Dragonborn in 4th edition. It's probably not what I'm going to play, but whatever. You write it in there. You have a good time. And so, I think that when I say kind of as progressive as I could be at the time, that's the kind of stuff that I was thinking of. We were trying to actively...
It's where you were.
Be better than some of the prior art on this, but we certainly weren't where I'd want to be now. And let's see, other kind of like, I guess actually this is a good transition into my overall kind of theory of like old, why old D&D can still matter, and why we still make new role-playing games on top of that, even ones that look kind of like D&D. And the best analogy I've been able to come up with is cars. Like you may want to buy a classic car because you find it really cool. Like there are distinct, handling and styling and aesthetic things, and even some history attached to
some emotion.
I'm not much of a car person, so I can't name a specific car, but some cool old car. On the other hand, if you just want something that's going to get you around, you're probably better just walking off the lot with a Honda Civic or something that'll have a Bluetooth radio and air conditioning or whatever. And I think that's, to me, part of the like Dungeon World is the Honda Civic of D&D, I guess, is the pull quote there. It's an economical, easy to get into, but it'll do. I owned a Honda Civic while I was making Dungeon World. It was great. I love that car. In that sense, it like there's a space both for the old thing that probably takes a bit more work to enjoy, and probably if somebody just says, I need a new car, you're not going to be like, let me get you a classic Mustang. You're going to be like, oh yeah, let's go to the Kia dealership or whatever. And so that's kind of my analogy of role-playing games.
I'm stealing it. I'm stealing it because like you're saying that out loud. Like, so I just recently discovered Forbidden Lands, which is Free Leagues, right? And it's the closest to OCR that I've gotten. I'm a little resistant to it because I've played those. I don't need to play them again. But what is interesting me about Forbidden Lands is it feels like I bought my Honda Civic that I had in high school, but it has Bluetooth connectivity. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I'm totally stealing that analogy, because there's like the hex crawl, man. Like we used to do hex crawls, and it sucked. It wasn't that much fun. But what Free League has done is they've said, okay, here's a hex crawl. Here's what you didn't realize you loved about it. And then we're going to give you some Bluetooth, and we're going to take the CD player and 8-track out. And, we're going to add a few more things that make this more enjoyable. And I hadn't thought about it, but in many ways, Dungeon World does that as well, right? Which is here's what you know, here's what you're familiar with, but we're going to update a few things, and we're going to get rid of some things that you didn't realize you didn't enjoy because 5 years later, after you played Dungeons and Dragons, you don't remember the THACO sucked, right? What you remember was those awesome moments, and we're going to try to streamline that and make that happen. So that's a good analogy, man. The car analogy is good, even though I'm not a car guy either.
Yeah. I mean, I've watched some Top Gear, and that's about as far as I get with cars. But it's resonated with me in that, like, I can see why people appreciate something old and classic, and also why that's probably not the thing that you choose if somebody needs something primarily functional, for example. So I've played. I think Moldvay is my go-to for D&D, for early D&D, and I've played it with people without a whole lot of RPG background, and like they have a good enough time, but I don't think they're the people that I've seen that enjoy it the most are definitely the people who are partially there for some of the quirks and the the historical perspective and the historical presentation. Even like I have my Moldvay box right back there that is beat up and old and falling apart, and it smells in a good way, but it smells a little bit.
And the art invokes memories. And I was just watching on Amazon Prime has got a documentary on the history of the art of D&D. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. I started watching it, and they're talking to Elmore and some of those old artists, and they bring up pictures during the presentation stage. And I'm shocked at the memories it invokes. I'm like, I remember that picture. Yeah. Like I remember building adventures I never ran around that picture. I ran them in my head, and like, these are images I haven't seen in 30 years. And they come up on the screen. I'm like, holy shit. Like, and it's that emotional thing. And here's the car analogy. It's the same thing as buying an old Mustang for some people. Right. And they go like, I remember that car. I had the Trans Am. And I'm going to buy it again, because when I was 17 and had the Trans Am, I didn't have the money to turn it into something new. And now I do, because I'm 50 years old, and it's all of that is part of it. And it, I love that idea that you're hinting at and being explicit about at the same time, Sage, of saying, White Box wasn't perfect, but there's things we remember about playing White Box that are important and significant. And we can take those and distill it down and figure out what it really was, and try to get rid of what was in the way.
Well, and I'm going to challenge you just a tiny bit on that, because I think there's an interesting thing there. There's perfect can mean a lot of things, I guess, is what I'm getting to. Like, in some ways there's a perfection to something that existed at a time, and we get to go back and view it as a thing that was made then, and it is a perfect embodiment. It's a perfect artifact in some ways. And then there's also perfect in kind of like functionality, or maybe ease of use. Like I never want to go back to Thaco. That isn't interesting to me. And so like there's we can combine both of those things. We can, I feel like RPGs as a kind of field have advanced. There are interesting new ideas on how to structure, run, present role-playing games that have come about, and we can absolutely use those, but they don't undermine how good old things were. They just open up kind of new ways of being good, and some of those ways of being good are perhaps more measurable in the how quickly can you learn this game kind of stuff. That is relatively quantifiable with, variation between people and stuff. And sure, we can optimize for that. And it is kind of nice to be able to point to our new games and be like, yeah, you can pick this up and be playing in way less time. That is kind of a concrete advancement. But that doesn't mean that the old ones, older games that maybe took longer to set up or didn't pay off in the first few sessions, for example, are less good or less perfect now. It just means that we have a different set of tools. And so, if we're looking, I guess back to the car analogy, like if your goal is to get from place A to B, you're going to want a lot of those kind of modern things that make it, easier to start your car on a cold day or whatever. But if you are looking, that doesn't mean that some kind of old classic isn't like a perfect artifact, a perfect thing in existence. Anyway, this is I get what you're putting down, and I don't mean to nitpick on the word perfect. I just think it's really interesting to explore that.
Well, and it's kind of ties into a lot of what we've been talking about, Sage, which is it's real easy to look back and criticize, right? And forget what was first and how that matters, right? So slow down a second. I backhanded Gygax a little bit by saying he backed into role playing, right? So that's a little bit of a kind of a twisted backhanded statement by my thing. The reality is he created something, right? And out of whole cloth. So yeah, we can say that, it started here and it's been expanded and built on and improved. And you know what? 5th edition is probably better than what Gygax made. But God damn it, he was first. It didn't exist before them, right? And that matters, and that's significant. And those points of advancement should be allowed to be great in their own way. Am I off key here?
No, I think you're right. And like, I think the point that I'd add to that is better for what? Like if I'm gonna, my kids are getting close to the age where I'm going to start getting to play role-playing games with them. They've already been kind of asking, and like if D&D isn't where I'd start, but if I were to sit down and play D&D with them, yes, I'd probably start with 5th edition. Like it's straightforward and easy to get into. It has a lot of good, easy things to leverage. Has a ton of support. Has easy to get, good-looking books. That's a plus as well. But is that? And that is better for that use for sure. But is it better for say running a underground dungeon exploration of like weird strange creatures and skin of your teeth kind of like Lubby adventures, for lack of a better, like part of what I like about Mold Bay is that like a lot of the adventures look kind of like they're not very good at what they do. Like there's and better again can also I am the kind of person who occasionally I am playing a game and I hit some weird counterintuitive mechanic and I actually love it just because it's a surprise and it's different and it's weird. One of the games that I'm playing right now is actually an online game of a computer game called Solium Infernum, which is made by a guy who now designs board games because he decided he wasn't very good at programming, and it kind of shows. You all play Dukes of Hell, and you're trying to get the most prestige by the time a new leader is chosen or whatever. And you do this by taking places of power and buying relics and backstabbing each other, et cetera, et cetera. Like the mechanics are all great, but it's old and clunky, and there are a ton of mechanics that are weird. And if you were just looking for the easiest game to play that kind of overall scenario with a bunch of friends of like, I want to play against a bunch of friends for control and winning through a, not quite 4X, but a acquire and build kind of game. There are certainly better on-ramps for that will get you playing on that, have much better graphics, be written by somebody who was not using like a scripting language on a toy UI. But this game and all the weird, funky parts of it are kind of why I love it. And to some degree, Moldvay is the same way. Like it has weird, counterintuitive things that feel funky and strange and put me a little out of the most straightforward way of doing things. And so in that sense, for certain kinds of games, that is better. And D&D always has this problem that like they revise the game and they always kind of need to market it as better. They want you to buy the new version. And so they always have to show off the improvements. And my personal feeling is that even across pretty much all the editions, with maybe 3rd and 5th being the only ones that overlap a whole lot, I would mostly choose each edition for a different kind of game. And in my perfect, I run D&D kind of world, D&D would actually be multiple product lines serving these different, publish new adventures for BCMI. There's so many ways to be better.
There is, and it's funny you say that because like, think about this. People can shit on 4th edition all day long, right? There's an industry built on shitting on 4th edition. If someone comes up to you and says, I love Elder Scrolls, I love playing Skyrim, you know what the best edition of D&D to introduce them to is 4th edition.
I mean, I played a wonderful game of fourth edition once I started to realize that you basically like set it up like Mass Effect. Like you had a few kind of like semi-branching story interactions where people can make a few choices, and then you had a few big and like you had some easy to drop in interchangeable combats, and then you had a few big set pieces that you really steered people towards.
Yep.
And that's not typically how I like to play. I'm not much of a like steer me towards the next thing, but those big set pieces were pretty good. And like actually the board games derived from 4E were actually pretty fantastic. Like the 4E system made a really good like adventure board game. I just wish they had even more leveling up than they did. But like there's so many ways for role-playing games to be good, and even for D&D to be good, that I this in some ways goes back to that classic car kind of thing. Like, depending on your use, you can want anything. For like we haven't even talked about a pickup truck, for example. If I'm saying I got a lot of stuff I need to move, that brand new Honda Civic isn't going to be as good as some F-150 or whatever. So yeah, like I totally agree with you that like there are meaningful improvements between whatever old edition you want to pick and fifth. It's just interesting to also see where these old things can still be the best.
Well, and we're now far enough along too, and I think this is significant as well. Role-playing games are young. Even if you go back to when they began, they're still young. And that means now that we are 30, 40, 50 years into this, that there is value in going back and mining that and understanding that. So guys, we're going to take a quick break. When we get back from this break, I want to talk a little bit about what's exciting Sage these days about the role-playing industry and what his thoughts are. So we'll be right back. There are so many online retailers. It can be hard to find one that is trustworthy, has great prices, along with some reliable customer service. On the third floor, we love ordering our gaming goodies from Gadzooks Gaming. Their selection of terrain, miniatures, dice, custom decor, and conversion bits are curated for gamers by gamers. You'll find they have what you need and what you didn't know you needed to take your gaming fun to the next level. If you mention Third Floor Wars in the cart notes of your order, you'll also get a free gift. And you'll help support the podcast. Check out gadzooksgaming.com and mention Third Floor Wars on checkout to get that free gift. So, if you haven't already figured it out, Sage has, and this is part of the reason I was so excited about it, have him on the show. I'm trying to think of the right term. Not an intellectual view on everything, but a cerebral view, I think is a better way to put it, right? And I think if we went back 12 years, knowing what happened, we could say, something's about to happen, right? The bakers are doing something and they're communicating a lot with a lot of different people in their own little circle there. And Harper was part of that circle, and something's brewing and it's going to change role-playing games. And then, a year or two later, Apocalypse World comes out and, suddenly it explodes and things like that. I'd be interested to know, Sage, today, is there things that you're seeing brewing right now that really pique your interest, that may turn into nothing, but stuff that you go, this is interesting and it could be something? I'd be interested in what you're smelling right now.
Sure. So let's see. There's a few things that stand out to me there. One of those is the RPGC kind of scene or collection of folks, which is RPG and then SEA, which I always immediately read as Seattle, but is actually Southeast Asia. There is a extremely interesting set of designers working from various parts of Southeast Asia and doing work that kind of spans various parts of the RPG community. So like there's Lorne Song of the Bachelor, which is an adventure by, I'm going to butcher his name, Zedek. I'm going to have to look it up because his last name I don't think I can even do. But it's an amazing OSR adventure that is Southeast Asian inspired, and it has one of the most interesting dungeons. I'm having to talk around because there's a bit of a potential twist to it that I don't want. I've read it because I'm going to run it someday, but I don't want to spoil it because as a player, it's not a gotcha kind of thing, but and it's the kind of thing that you will maybe even find out pretty quickly. But I absolutely don't want to give it away before you get a chance to play it. Zedek Su. So there's a few things. First of all, it is beautifully presented, and the art style and writing bring in some of the cultures that it is pulling from. The adventure itself has some extremely cool ways of creating a dynamic environment that is still recognizably a dungeon, that are really interesting to me. And the adventure also has an element of dealing with colonization. So like there's a small village, there's kind of an imperial power that is involved here, and in a really interesting decision, it doesn't point the players specifically at like, these are obviously the bad guys and you have to side against them. Like, it is presented somewhat that you could choose to kind of be the bad guys and be like, we're on this side. And the imperial power is not the main problem of the adventure. They are a complicating factor. Which at first I was like, I want this to be more pointed about this being, I want to fight the man. And on the other hand, looking at it more, I can kind of see, in some ways it's making a statement about how these power structures prey on people who are already having problems, and how they bring in their solutions, which may not make, almost certainly don't make things any better. And that is more thought-provoking and nuanced and a better adventure than a straight up like, hey, there's some bad guys here, go punch them.
Well, and you think about Southeast Asia and its relationship with totalitarianism is very complicated because it's been external and internal at different phases, right? Mm-hmm. And that's fascinating that's what's coming out of it.
Yeah. And some of the other RPGC related folks are doing things more on the kind of exploratory small game side of things. There's a game called Karen Dunn that I have unfortunately not been able to explore as much as I would like to, but the subtitle there is Make God Bleed. And you are basically I think the phrase they actually use is like worthless heroes dismantling a god. And it's inspired by...
That's phenomenal. What a great sentence.
Yeah. It's inspired by Filipino culture and like folklore and stuff. And there's amazing stuff there. And I'm actually, okay. I was about to open up my set of PDFs here, but I'm just going to end up listing so many games that it would take up the rest of the time, and I should hit on a few other interesting things. But RPGC, I think, is one of the most interesting kind of development scenes or communities, circles going on these days. I'm also super into journaling games. So this has perhaps unsurprisingly also spiked during the pandemic, but
yes, it has.
Single player role-playing games are like, I actually, before we had a name for them, journaling games, I wrote a game like this. I should actually re-release it now that I'm talking about it.
You put it on an itch, come on.
Exactly. So like lots of these games are an itch, but like the in mine, it was you're a traveling like an artist or a performer on the road, like a band or a solo act or whatever. And you're basically, your journaling was supposed to be your blog updates. of like you basically are doing like a show blog kind of thing. So yeah, anyway, here I am talking about my own work when I'm supposed to be talking about what's exciting, and
You're
that game
so
is old.
egocentric, dude. It's embarrassing, Sage.
I know it really is. But anyway, these single player journaling games are really interesting to me, partially because of how they can fit in time constraints. You know, in principle, a single player game is one that you can schedule whenever you want to. And as somebody who, like most of my friends, are the stay up late types, and I'm the get up early type. So something that I could potentially kind of play early in the morning for anybody else is convenient. And some of the games to think of there, 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. That one is probably one of the biggest in kind of the scene.
That's one I've actually heard of. Yeah.
Yeah. Sigils in the Dark is one that I want to play. There's a couple of others that were on my list, but yeah. Artifact, which is basically you're writing the history of a like artifact basically. And there's the designer recently kickstarted a semi-sequel based on the some of the same ideas called Bucket of Bolts, where you're doing a spaceship that is, you know, going through multiple crews and multiple uses, and eventually you've got kind of like the Millennium Falcon or something like that. So yeah, those journaling games are very high on my list.
And do you consider this, and I'm being a little obtuse here, but are those role-playing games?
Oh man. So I always try to not define role-playing games because it results in pain. But I will say the closest definition that I have of a game where the fiction and the rules feed back into each other, it hits that. So the interesting thing, if my definition cuts out anything that most people would, or which has been certainly called a role-playing game, it would be the game Microscope. That one actually doesn't fit my definition. So yeah, other than that one, and I don't mean this to exclude Microscope. It's just me pushing the boundaries of my own definition. But yeah. Anyway, so let's see. Those are journaling games, the RPGC community. I'm gonna shout this one out, even though it's a little more focused than some of the others. A company called Gem Room Games that have basically 3 things out there right now, all of which are so on brand for things that I am into that I feel like they are basically just making games for me at this point. And I know that for at least one of their games, Dungeon World was in part of inspiration. So like I appreciate having inspired something. So they have a game called High Magic Low Lives, which I just had to bring up so I can read the summary because it's one of my favorite sentences written to describe a game. High Magic Low Lives is a science fantasy tabletop role-playing game about wizard school dropouts who get into trouble with the immortal aristocracy to make coin and build their hashtag brand.
That's phenomenal.
So yeah, you are washout wizards in trouble with like the order of wizardry of power that does everything, and you're building your hashtag brand, and that is great. They have Subway Runners, which is basically you are gig economy monster hunters going into subways to find monsters and repair the subway. And then they just released, so they did not make this game, but there's a game called Morkborg, which is
I keep hearing about that.
It's an OSR adjacent kind of old school game. It has a lot of cool things, though I will say by far the coolest thing is the presentation. I think game design wise, it's pretty cool. Presentation wise, it's amazing. But Gem Room Games made their own like hack derivative of it called Duckborg, which is a fantasy take on DuckTales. Which one of my huge obsessions is DuckTales and the really good comics it's based on. And so, Duckborg has been blowing my mind for at least a week.
That's fun.
Those 3 games are all basically, I am the epitome of the audience for all of them. And I find it really exciting when I look at the Gem Room Games, which is Dan Phipps and Callie Lowry. A lot of stuff that they are doing just immediately. It's cool to see people working in the same kind of space that I work in. I mentioned before, really appreciating the people who can make challenging kind of introspective games, but my center of gravity is around this kind of stuff. And so it's great to see people making this. So I don't have to, one thing that John Harper and I say to each other a lot is when we find out somebody else is making a game that sounds very similar to something we did, we just saved ourselves a lot of work. I'm really glad to see things like this out there.
Well, and it's neat to get excited, right? It's neat to go like, this is exciting. And it doesn't have to be good necessarily or perfect, to use a term we've been playing with. It's exciting and it's fun. So I'm going to, at the beginning of the podcast, Sage, I subjected you to my standard question of how did you get into gaming? And unfortunately now I'm going to subject you to another standard question of mine.
Of course.
What the hell happened? So when I left role-playing games, I had to kind of do the wink and nudge and go, do you play D&D? Like, I kind of like playing D&D. Or if I was on my 6th date with a girl, I might mention that I, know what Dungeons and Dragons is. And then I come back and it is bigger than it's ever been. And it is something that people seek out now and people are familiar with. And when my wife introduced me to her friends, they know what it is. So I would be curious, Sage, what happened when I was away? In your mind, why is role-playing bigger now than it's ever been before?
That's a really good question. So to be perfectly honest, when you've mentioned kind of the gap and coming back to something very different a few times before. And until you phrased the question that way, I had actually been a little skeptical of like, are things really that different? But when you phrase it like that, things are absolutely very different. And so, different. Now I'm more willing to buy into your question. I was, I would have answered the question no matter what, but I was definitely
you would have been polite.
Yeah, I was definitely a little on the like, really, is it I don't want to make it sound like there's been some massive shift, but I think there have been a few things. So actual play streamed online has been a huge difference there. And like, on the one hand, is a huge positive in that it's, opening up so many more opportunities to see people playing different games. On the other hand, I think it is skewing some perspective because, frankly, the games that I play in don't look a whole lot like the games that you see run online. None of my friends are like professional voice actors. Nobody has that much time. I mean, maybe John Harper does, but even he doesn't have that much time. There's some unrealistic expectations there, and there's also some misaligned incentives in some ways. If you are a streamer streaming a game, your best interest is in making a stream that gets people to watch and subscribe and hit like. Press like and subscribe, whatever.
Play D&D, right? If you want viewers, play D&D.
You play D&D and you play it big and you play it in a way that is as discernibly yours as possible while also making that something that other people can pick up. Which there are some good aspects there. It's showing people like, hey, this is a set of like procedures that you engage with. And obviously when you engage with a procedure, you shift it some. Like that is just a thing that happens. On the other hand, I think it tends to push for certain kinds of games and certain ways of structuring them that don't function the best when your goal is to run a game for you and your friends. And if you use this as an example of how certain games are played, it also tends to skew them because the game as it's played on a stream may not be the same. And there's also that kind of like, if you're a streamer, you want to make your mark on it. You don't just want to run, D&D is so broad anyway, but let's say Apocalypse World, you don't want to just run kind of the most straightforward Mad Max version of it. You want to have your own specific drift on it so that your stream stands out from everybody else's. And so, I think it's a big reason for that shift. It's a big reason for awareness. But there's also some aspects of it that I don't love. And there's also kind of the spectacle and personal brand of it. You know, we talked a bit earlier about being able to take harsh criticism and act on it as being kind of a learned skill that's very important. When your personal, like, part of that ties into growth mindset, where you view intelligence in particular, but other parts of yourself as well, as not intrinsic things. I am smart, but things that you work on and do, like I worked really hard to study for this test, so I did well, whatever. Once you are a streamer with a personal brand, your identity is part of what you are marketing. And so it makes it much harder to have that kind of growth and change mindset, because you're and man, I'm way out of my league in talking about this, but this is my personal opinion from this. And especially, you know, when in some of these big, the biggest things, the you know, role plays and stuff like that, I think it shows through a little bit in how they deal with problems and with when things go off the rail. So anyway, like that, I think is streaming overall is one big reason for why things are different. I think another is shifts in how games are made. You know, Vincent Baker and Ron Edwards were pretty pioneering in finding ways to publish a game that did not involve selling your idea to some small company that would probably be under in a few years anyway. And part of that is, you know, them doing the legwork to figure out this stuff. Part of it is the differences in economy of scale and being able to buy digital copies and stuff like that all come around. And so, you know, the barrier to entry for Adam and I making a role-playing game was much lower thanks to that kind of work from those folks. And that then kind of opened the floodgates, and it also broadened the set of authors. You know, like a publishing industry tended to, like, you know, the RPG publishing industry, mostly run by larger companies, tended to have the problems that most large industries do of prioritizing, you know, for the most part, straight white dudes. And democratizing that some has given more people, has at least helped with that part of it. There are certainly still a ton of other hurdles that are completely unfair and uneven, but like that bitterness has added games from voices that we probably wouldn't have heard otherwise, like Whitney Beltran, is a designer that comes to mind there that I think possibly might have not had. We wouldn't have Bluebeard's Bride if not for some of the advances that we've made in these opportunities. And let's see, other things that have changed. The other aspect there that I wanted to talk about, I guess, is kind of that technological aspect. You know, we had our car analogy that we kind of, you know, ran into the ground a little bit, but
we did a little bit.
We've found some ways to make some things faster and easier, which in a lot of ways means better. You know, not in all the ways, but practically, if you wanted to sit down and play D&D with somebody, 5th edition is a quicker and easier way of doing that than pretty much any edition before it. And it's more straightforward and easy to explain and scales a little better. And so those kinds of, you know, quality of life improvements make a big difference in how many people kind of bounce off the game. You know, we talked about my initial experience with 2nd edition, and that could have easily been my last experience. Like, that was not an easy game to scale or get into, and practically I didn't. I went to 3rd edition because it came out not too long after. And so I think, you know, it's weird to say RPG technology, but the set of tools that designers are working with have broadened out there. And I think part of that goes back to more brains working in this area. Ryan North, in his book about how to invent everything, makes a comment that if you were rebuilding society, the thing that you want the most is more people, because more brains are your biggest asset. And I feel like that's the same in the design side of things. You know, part of what excites me about RPGC and itch games in general. Like you kind of alluded to it, but like itch is an amazing advancement in how easy it is to get a small game out there and to even build a little bit of community around it.
Yep.
Those things get more brains in the room and get more ideas out there, and that tends to move the state of the art forward.
Do you think there's any generational aspects to this as well, Sage? So, for example, you explicitly said, your kids are getting close to getting old enough to be introduced to role-playing games. My dad did not introduce me to role-playing games. Did you think that's a part of it too, that goofballs like you and me that played as kids now have kids?
I think that is certainly a part of it. I think there's also the fact that, like, as a generational thing, the memories that we have of D&D are different than folks before us, and that kind of broadening of the hobby makes it easier to bring folks in. I think there's also a generational aspect just in which designers had which precedents to work from, kind of a shoulder of giants thing, but also the kind of, which things aren't derived from D&D that we talked about a lot earlier on. The set of games that, let's say Vincent Baker, because I obviously played Apocalypse World and based a lot of my stuff on that, and I don't want to use myself as an example. The set of games that Vincent Baker had to play was different than, say, what Steve Jackson had to play before creating GURPS. And so there, as these ideas exist and intermingle, there is a bit of a generational thing that, like, there are certain games that were super influential to me from being very active on the Story Games forum for a certain window around when Dungeon World was made that still probably loom larger in my memory than Dungeon World do in some ways. And by, most of the kind of more objective measures of success of, copies sold or whatever, far outrank them. So like there was a game called Ganakagak, which was about basically people on an ice-locked iceberg surviving in kind of a semi-Inuit society. There was How We Came to Live Here, which was based on Native American stories. And, these games, looking back, I actually don't even remember the creators of both of those, but I wonder some about these may have been more appropriation and stuff, but like these are games that loomed really large in conversations when Dungeon World felt like a small thing. And now, I bet I couldn't even find a copy of some of them. And that's not to say that they that's a good fate for them, or that, somehow Dungeon World is better. It's just like there's a difference as you, which things you had to reference and which things you kind of grew up on, that makes a difference there. I think another aspect of this is also where digital games have gone in this time. So, the when D&D was competing against Diablo 2 or whatever, that's a very different kind of set of things to compare to. And I remember some early 3E ads that were like, oh, you want to, better graphics in your imagination or whatever. And like the typical kind of things that you might do to kind of take pot shots at video games from a role-playing perspective. And now that competition that set of things looks a lot different. The games that we have out there now are so drastically increased in scope, and there are so many more games that are multiplayer from the ground up, which creates more emergent behavior. And those things, I think, in some ways carve out a different space for role-playing games. I think it was easy at one point for role-playing games to basically look at themselves as like an improved version of computer games. And I think now it's clearer that those are very separate things.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very good point. They're in their own lanes. Right. And I mean, we talk about the revolutions of role-playing games because this is a tabletop, podcast, but we could, obviously huge revolutions in digital games, and it's just part of that too, and that's very influential. Well, boy, oh boy, Sage, we covered a lot of stuff, man.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, this was absolutely phenomenal, and I had big expectations, and they were exceeded. So if somebody is listening now, and they want Dungeon World, there's a lot of different places where they can get Dungeon World. Where's the best place for them to get it?
Oh man, whatever's most convenient to them, honestly. Like there are differences in how much profit we make, but like I was saying earlier, this game has already exceeded by far any expectation I could ever have. If you are in the position to spend money on a game, like I always try not to bring down the value of my game too much, because while I don't necessarily need more money from it at this point, I don't want to race to the bottom and make others lower the prices on theirs. So we still charge hopefully a fair price for it. RPG or Drive-Thru RPG is maybe one of the easiest. You can also buy it directly from Burning Wheel, who is our publisher at this point. I think those are the two main ones. And which one? Technically we make more money from one than the other. It doesn't really matter. Just buy it where it's most convenient to you.
And if somebody wants just more Sage, where's a good place for them to go?
My starting point is usually my Twitter, partially because my personal website is rarely updated and has a domain name.
I noticed that, by the way.
Explain. Yeah. I actually was thinking the other day, I had a good idea for a post and now I've lost it. But yeah, my Twitter, which is old Fortran, old with an E _ Fortran, is usually the kind of first stopping point. And from there, you can go to my amazing website because, I don't know, a couple of years ago now, I really decided that I wanted to find, I used to do, well, it's still live with a mirror of the same content, LaTorra.org, because I was like, oh, I want my last name as a domain. I can have my first name and my last name. Cool. But it's not a very cool domain name. So a while ago, I decided to try and find any D&D monsters that you could split out the last 2 or 3 letters into a valid top level domain and have the entire URL be the name of a monster. The only one of those
to get you a hobby.
This is my hobby. The only one of those that was available is Civiferneblin, the rock gnomes, because .in is the TLD for top level domain for India. So unfortunately, it's a monster name that is incredibly tough to pronounce, and I half phenomenal. The time can't remember how to spell it. But since, as we've kind of established here, I'm not exactly in this for the high profile and perfect marketing, my website is one that I can't even pronounce. That's why I lead people to my Twitter, because then you can click on my website and get my amazing domain. The domain name is probably the best part of the
even website, if you don't put anything on there. Yeah, well, that's great. We'll have links to all of that in the show notes. And Sage, we're going to have to figure out an excuse to have you come back on, because I really enjoyed this, man.
I would be happy to. This has been a blast, and I hope it's half as much fun to listen to as I've had talking with you. This has been great.
I hope so too. Hey, did you hear that? You leveled up. You finished another episode of Tabletop Talk from Third Floor Wars. If you want more from the Third Floor, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Head on over to our YouTube channel. It is packed with painting tutorials, gaming tips, battle reports, and role-playing actual plays. Did you enjoy this episode? Why don't you send a link to one of your friends so they can enjoy it too? Last but not least, write us a review on your podcatcher of choice. This helps us find listeners almost as cool as you. You, my friend, are a phenomenal freaking guest.
Thanks. Thanks for saying that, because I was worried I was kind of going too far afield, or yeah.
This is what my podcast is. This is what I strive for. Let's as soon as we forget, as soon as it's me trying to learn about Sage and Sage learning about Craig, and we're just kind of bouncing and I agree with you and you're wrong, and here's another way to think about it. As soon as that starts happening, it's I think when it turns into something that's interesting for people to listen to. So it's a good energy, man. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for setting this up. This is a ton of fun. I'm glad to be providing you with a recording that other people can listen to, but it's also just super fun talking about this stuff. Yeah.
Well, I enjoy doing it. That's why I do it, because I mean, it's given me a chance to talk to a lot of people. I've learned, like, dude, you might not be amazed. It's incredible how much I've learned in a year. It's just with these conversations, like I feel like I've caught up in and so I've talked to people like, the Bakers and you and John, and I've got Kenson coming on, who made Icons, which is this whole thing, and stuff like that. But I've also booked Steve Jackson. And like, that's going to be fascinating. Like, that's going to be real interesting, because, Steve Jackson is who was my superhero, 25 years ago. And I have no idea where Steve Jackson is today. And I'm dying to talk to him. I'm very interested to see what that conversation is going to be, And, I mean, those are conversations I wouldn't have had without this podcast.
One of my most influential games that I ever played in was a GURPS game. Like, it was, oh man, I'm gonna have to find. I'm so bad at listening to podcasts these days because I don't have a commute anymore. But I'm gonna have to find time to listen to you talking to Steve Jackson, because that'd be amazing.
So, and John asked me to do this too, so I'll do the same thing. Is every once in a while, like I'll release an episode, and I was like, I think John would find this interesting. I just shoot him a link. And
please do.
And I'll do this. I'll do the same thing with you, Sage. And if you listen to it, great. If you don't have time, no big deal. But that way you don't have to monitor the damn thing, because we're all busy. But all right. So what I'm thinking here, actually, I'm not gonna set it up for you. I'm gonna make you talk through it live. You ready?
Okay, that sounds great.
Fantastic segment.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm glad that worked. I realized that we were kind of like moving through topics pretty quickly, so I hope that was okay. But
well, yeah, my only complaint about it is that I want to dig deeper, right? So and that's exactly what I'm going to do, because both of these things, which is the origin of the game, but so I read your Twitter thread where the guy called you out a little bit, and respect the shit out of how you responded to that. Just so you know. And I think that is, and I don't want test subject was a terrible phrase that I used for you, but
I don't mind. I'm good with it.
But you have an interesting arc, right? And there's solid landmarks in that arc, and I'm fascinated by that arc. I talked to Megan Vincent about it. I've talked to a couple people about it, and your perspective on it's going to be really interesting. So
sure.
But I'm going to go back to boring Dungeon World stuff here. Absolutely. I'll bring us back. Hey, are you still here? Look, the podcast is over, and you sat through all of the breaks and bloopers? Well, I mean, if you're here, you might as well run over to patreon.com and become a supporter. Don't forget to rate and review this podcast too while you're at it, on whatever platform you're listening to. I do appreciate you sticking around. Take care.